Okay, so thank you everyone for coming back. As I told you in the beginning, my name is Laura Osorio. I am a junior fellow scholar, and I'm doing my PhD in the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo, which is part of the University of Oslo. So my presentation is titled Reconstructing Home, Craft Making Among Wonan Migrants. This presentation will touch upon several issues that have come up in my own research that I began in 2016. So these are fairly recent things that I'm still thinking about and that will at some point come into my final dissertation. Okay, so just as a very general context, for those of you that are not familiar with South American geography, Colombia is located here. And this is a close-up of Colombia. So today I will be talking of a community, an indigenous community that lives in Colombia, which are called the Wonan. This community used to live in, or are still living, both at the same time, in the Pacific coast of the country, which is this part. So this is a region that is called Chocó. And more specifically, they live in a river, which is at the southern part of this area, more or less around like here. That's called San Juan. So why am I saying that they live and used to live at the same time? It's because part of the community is still living in that area, but some other people have migrated into different parts of the country, also to Panama, and some into the northernmost part of Ecuador. So we have some people that have stayed and others that have migrated into other areas. The part of the Wonan community that has migrated has generally done so in the search of better jobs, better educational options, and in some cases also because of the armed conflict that is still in this area. So today I will talk specifically about the people that have migrated into Bogota, which is the capital of Colombia. And most of my informants have migrated from Chocó to Bogota because of security reasons. So one of their family members has been threatened, and then they have to leave this area into a safer environment. The places that Wonans in general have migrated to are Bogota, a nearby city, Medellin, they're more to the northern part, and Buenaventura, which is a bit more to the southern part. This is a, let's say, close-up of the San Juan River. So it's all of this area that goes up into the upper part of the image. So the San Juan River is around 380 kilometers, and Wonan communities tend to dwell in the riverbanks of this river. So the San Juan region, this is a very, just an image to illustrate more or less how it looks like, is composed of thick rainforest. It is an environment that is rich in natural resources such as wood and gold. However, because of this, or in spite of this richness of natural resources, the Chocó, where San Juan is located, is still one of the least developed areas in Colombia. So this means that access to education is very low. Also, the quality of the education is low. Same with health services. And transport services, again, this is a problem. So meaning that rivers are the most important pathway into communicating with other people in the surrounding areas. For Wonan people that live in San Juan, generally their livelihood is taken from their cropping and their harvesting and also selling of the extras to gain some money, and also working in jobs related to the wood industry as well as the production of crafts. that they sell in order to get some income. So this means that for Wonan people, the connection with the landscape and their surrounding environment is a very strong connection, because for most of their daily tasks that are related to livelihood, they have to engage with their surrounding environment. In the case of basket production, of craft production, fiber and ink plants are in the surrounding area. So every time that an artisan requires certain plants or certain inks, they would go into the forest and search for their materials. Okay, so the Wonan community is well known in the crafts market because of this object or similar objects like this one that you see in the picture, which are woven from fiber that's called huerregue, which is like the normal name that people use for it. The technique is coiling technique. Here you have an image that kind of helps you imagine this. Coiling begins with a center knot that you start weaving around, so it grows like a spiral, and then you can create all sorts of different shapes out of this technique. So I would like for you to bear with me for a little bit, because here I will start giving a bit more information about the huerregue fiber. But there is a reason why I'm going to give you the background information. It's in order for us to understand why huerregue is so important and why it connects Wonan people in the urban area with their home in Chocó, or their past home in Chocó. So, huerregue, the palm tree, looks like this. It is a plant that is very difficult to harvest, because if you can notice in that image specifically, the trunk as well as the leaves are all covered in spines. So it's a very dangerous task to carry out. Because the tool that has to be used is a blade that is put at the edge of a very, very long wooden stick, it's generally men that harvest the leaf. So after the men harvest the leaf, they take this, like the full leaf to their female partners, and then it is the women that continue the full process of making or preparing the fiber. Huerregue is a palm tree that grows in Colombia, in Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Panama. Its habitat is generally lowland rainforests, which are usually placed in elevations below 200 meters. So in the Colombian territory, primarily it is the Chocó region where you can find this plant. So after the plant or the leaf is cut, then the women extract the center part of the leaf, which is the one that is actually used for making the thread. They cut it into threads, wash it, and then dry it. This is how the fiber looks after all of that process has been done. Now, some of the people that I have worked with have migrated into Bogotá, specifically into this neighborhood that is called Ciudad Bolívar. Ciudad Bolívar is a neighborhood that is located in the southwestern part of Bogotá. So it's basically the outskirts of the city, and it is built in like the mountainous range that surrounds Bogotá. It is a place where generally people that have a low income can access to housing, either sponsored by the government, or there's a bit more affordable housing for them. So this is where people would go. Again, because it is in the outskirts and there's a lot of informal construction, it is very difficult to maintain good health and education services. So again, this is a problem in the area in Bogotá, in Ciudad Bolívar. There are high levels of criminality, which also makes it not such a safe environment to grow in. So when Wonan people arrived into this area, they basically encountered a very, very different landscape. They encountered a space that was mostly full of concrete, very scarce in terms of natural resources, And this was completely opposite to what they had experienced in Chocó, which was a more warm, humid, full with vegetation type of environment. So in the urban setting, the livelihood completely changed because plants were no longer available. So most of them went into construction jobs. Other people went into teaching jobs at local schools. Some women have gone into helping or acting as midwives for the community. But in most cases, women have concentrated all of their efforts in craft production. And this is how a lot, or a really big part of the family's income is earned now in the urban environment. It is the women making the baskets and then the men selling them that are earning a living for the full family. Now, this is the place, Ciudad Bolívar. This is how it looks like when you look at it a bit closer, where I met Clara. So this whole presentation will be a very intimate, I will not talk about the full group. I will address this specific case of Clara, which is a Wonan artisan in her late 50s that migrated from Chocó region into Bogotá around 2009 with her partner. So Clara became a very important person for my own research because she became my basket weaving teacher. So she was the one that taught me the literal things that I know about basket making, and it is through her that I started accessing, to some extent, the Wonan like identity and what it actually means to say that something is a Wonan tradition and another thing is not. One of the first things that Clara confronted when she arrived to this place was that she could no longer access her plants. So how would she actually manage to keep making crafts if the plants were no longer there? This was a very important problem to solve very fast because they needed to earn money somehow. So the way that they started to solve this problem was to think about transporting the material. So what happens generally when Clara needs to buy fiber and needs to start making a basket is that she will approach one of her family members or close acquaintances, and when this person is about to travel to Chocó, she asks them to get a specific amount of huergue fiber that she will later use for her baskets. The middle person that has been contacted will travel from Bogotá to Chocó, and there they will contact another person that has either the fiber already completely processed or they have it on a different stage. Then, if the fiber is not completely ready to be worked with, they will have to find another person that continues the process until it's finished to more or less be used. The whole process of traveling back from Chocó to Bogotá is a very long process. So when these people purchase the plant in Chocó, they have to travel through the river for several hours into the nearby city, which is in general Buenaventura. There they would take a bus that will take them to Bogotá. Generally that would be a travel of 12 hours. And when they arrive to Bogotá, they have to take another bus, generally 1 hour and 30 minutes or 2 hours, to reach Ciudad Bolívar. So depending if the fiber is completely ready or if it's not, this can be a process that can take either 20 hours or several weeks, which is generally the case because the fiber is not imminently ready when they arrive. So what I find interesting in the Wonan example is that it is social networks are created by diasporic objects like huergue. So in a way, the fact that huergue is moving from Chocó to Bogotá and all of the middle people that have to be there for that object to actually be able to make the full journey, this is expanding social networks for Wonan people and also maintaining social networks that already exist. So in a way, the diaspora of these objects like huergue help Wonan people to maintain some type of continuity after migration. They help them to maintain continuity because artisans are able to keep on doing this traditional task that they used to do back home. So when the fiver arrives to Bogota and Clara has final access to it, she will first evaluate the material. She will look at the quality of the fiver that she has received. And a very intimate body engagement will begin with this diasporic object, with the huergue fiver. What I have seen is that the fiver itself helps her to bring home to the present. And it is only because she engages physically with this material that memories of harvesting process, of cleaning and drying the fiver are brought back to her own mind, to the present. And a specific example of this happened when Clara was teaching me how to dye with different colors this fiver. So the first thing we had to do was to check the fiver for tones of green. What I didn't know, and was completely oblivious to, was that green shades in the fiver actually meant that a lot of rain was, there was a lot of rain back in Chocó. Clara told me that when the fiver tended to be white, that meant that there was a lot more sun back home. So in a way, just by looking at the properties of the fiver, Clara is able to spot weather conditions back home. She's able to know when there has been a more rainy season or when it has been drier. Another really interesting thing that I found out is that when she tests out the tension of the fiver, so when she puts a bit of tension to see if the quality is good enough, she's able to spot mistakes, or you could say the quality or the ability of the person that recollected or harvested the material. When the fiver is too brittle, is too weak, she can tell that the fiver was not harvested at the right time because it was harvested when there was new moon. When the fiver is strong and it can take her pull, it means that it was harvested in the right way. The person did cut the leaf when it was waning moon. So it is only by her actually touching, pulling this object that all of these memories of her back home that start coming up in this new environment. Another example of this is to very I'm not sure if the image helps us a lot, but I'll try to tell you what is there. Happens when we talk about designs. So something interesting about Wonan artisans is that they do not pick the pattern that they're going to make beforehand. They generally imagine the pattern as they're making. So they never use a reference throughout the process. So it is the making process that helps them to imagine and decide what pattern is going to be in that object. In one of the times that I met with Clara, she showed me this object, and then she showed me that in one of the parts around here, she had represented animals that were very common in Chocó. But what I did notice was that right next to those animals, there seemed to be figures of adults holding babies. So I asked her if this was actually the case, or what this represented. And she told me that that was actually, yes, an adult holding a baby. But that baby was actually a baby that she had helped to bring to life. She's a midwife, a couple of days before. So what I found that was very beautiful in this object was that in a way, as she was making this object in Bogota, in this urban landscape, she was remembering her home, she was remembering the landscape, the animals that she would see, but also memories of a more or less distant past were coming up, like the birth of this child. And then the object ended up fusing both in one single piece, you can say. So, in a way, what I find that very subtly is happening here is that these things are coming together in her mind and in the objects that she's making. But this is not, the distance cannot be completely pulled together. There is an impossibility of home in this case. So the case of Clara is the case of a lot of Hunan artisans that are still living in Bogota, which is that they will constantly be in between these two homes. And to some degree, this distance might not ever be overcome. So this happens because diasporic objects like huerregue, on the one hand, help artisans connect with home. So it is through the social networks that they enable, but also the body experiences that help evocate memories, that they help to reconnect with the home. But it's also the object itself, the huerregue fiber, that constantly reminds Clara that there is a distance, that she's no longer in full control of the whole process. So it is these mistakes, like the shades of green, the low resistance to tension, that remind her that she now relies on the expertise, or not so expertise, of several other people that are in between her materials. And this solidifies her distance once more to her home. Now, there are some other related knowledges to basket making. One of them is singing. And I would like to end with this because I think it's a very, it's just a very beautiful example. When Clara weaves, she generally sings as well. And in one of our classes, I asked her if there was any song that talked about weaving, if it told the story of weaving. And she told me that, yes, that there was one song. And then so she sang for me. And when she explained, she translated the meaning from Monmeo to Spanish, she told me that it was actually not another artisan, but her father that had taught her this song. Her father was a shaman, a man back in the community. And what she remembered while she was explaining the meaning of the song was that her father told her that when he died, it would be her responsibility to learn the song, already know it, and teach it to other people. So in a way, I think that the reconstruction of somewhat of a sense of home for Clara, but more specifically for the later generations that will start having even more trouble between their urban identity and the indigenous identity, could be helped to be a bit better with people like Clara. She actually teaches non-traditional singing to the children in the local school. So it is her task that is constantly rehearsed during the basket making process, like singing, that helps her to remember all of these things. And then that helps her to be able to solidify this knowledge and pass it on to the children that are growing up in this urban environment. So, yeah. So I think that's more or less it.
There has to be questions. Yeah. Yes, there has to be. all.
There's an inevitability about it. I mean, it's really fascinating stuff. I love the way the making and so on makes the connections. It's a slightly broader point I've got, which is about, is there a danger of kind of pathologizing this thing, this notion of home, that connection? And I suppose it's not just connected to, you know, the example you've given. It was there in, you know, many of my own talk and others this morning as well. But, you know, it does start from that idea that normality, the norm, is to be static, is to be in one place, grounded, rooted. Our ancestors have been here. Our, you know, the kids will be here forevermore. Human history, you know, seen in the bigger scale, isn't a history of stasis. It's a history of movement. So the language you're using, and we tend to do this, is one of loss and this distance that's grown, and that's something that's pathological, that we're harmed and so on. And the trouble is that this gets perpetuated in our own analytical vocabularies and so on, without us actually taking a step back and saying, but what, you know, why is that the assumption? Of course, we all, you know, we yearn for our childhoods, perhaps, if they've been positive things, or where we grew up, and, you know, we've moved. You know, that's really my comment. So, so despite that, there was this sense of a yearning for that connection with the authentic world, the rainforest, and so on, where the world of concrete and the city is, you know, and we go back through history and the relationship, you know, as Raymond Williams famously did, the country and the city and so on, this kind of relationship. So that's my question really. Is there a danger of perpetuating this idea of normal is once, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think there is. And I think as I was hearing you and, for example, Maya speak, I know that I was falling into some of the things you were spotting, like that we had to be careful with. Yes, I think one of the tricky things as I was making this presentation was that I wanted to talk about this very intimate state or individual experience, which is her experience of this longing for home. But there are so many different experiences of loss and not quite loss, especially in the younger generations of women that are growing in the urban surrounding. For the younger people, this is actually very cool. And they don't want to have to do anything that is related to these traditional practices. But then for some of them, this is important. So you have all of these different levels of wanting to move away from this past home and not be connected with it, especially with the younger generations. But with the older generations like Clara's, you have this experience of like trying to remember constantly. And
so will your PhD reflect the multiple ideas where making home can also be celebrating urban concrete Bogota, or is it the yearning? You know, how do you check yourself from being nostalgic?
Yeah, so that is a tricky thing. I am showing you basically a chapter of my dissertation, which will be this home building, but I am focusing in the rest of the dissertation on the objects themselves. So there will be a part, for example, when I talk about gender, because these baskets are made by women specifically, where I will bring the experience of a very young, like 26-year-old girl or woman that is showing like this new wave of women not being completely what to do with being told what to do from their male counterparts, but that they're going in a completely different environment, that of female empowerment and women have rights and you can speak up. And so I hope that I will be able to show all of these different layers of experience. Yeah.
I wanted to probably also hold on to the possibility that home, because you also showed two homes. You didn't show one home.
Mm.
You didn't only show that she was going back. You showed home in the present, in Bogota itself. So the question then, does the multiple homes offer you a possibility out of nostalgia? Rather than thinking that it's always going back, what does it mean for the present that she inhabits, or her future? Maya. Yes, yes, no, no. No, my questions are only to, I'm summing up in my head for when we talk later on, so let's go ahead.
Yeah, I know nothing more than I heard now, so yeah, maybe it's a limited scope here, but I'm just thinking about what this woman does. Okay, what you told us here, and you showed the technique and talked about this one person, but probably there are more such persons. But it could be, what is the economic, I mean, if you kind of turn this around and give us the story of this through an economic lens, then it's a wonderful success story that something that is so embedded and so dependent on the place, in the sense of where the plants grow or the trees grow and blah, blah, is still useful. I mean, her know-how, her expertise is so sellable or whatever, economically viable in a totally different place. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
Isn't that like absolutely positive? So you started with saying, look, it's actually the basket making that is making these people live whatever. Anyway, obviously they can live with this kind of trade. Obviously there is interest there. Someone is buying this. Maybe you said it, but I'm tired. Maybe I didn't hear. Is it just within the people who are used to this basket, or do they sell it to tourists or to urban dwellers? I don't remember if you said something about this, but it could be kind of told in terms of a story of incredible success. There's something that is embedded so deeply, physically, or whatever, biologically and culturally embedded in one place is transferable. Talking in terms of, again, Buddhist capitals like that, they're transferable to another place. I don't know if you have that aspect in your dissertation, but I think you should have it because it's a fascinating thing.
Yeah, it will have a part in the dissertation. Yeah, because the level of just creativity also, because here I just talked about the specific fiber, but in the dissertation I will talk about all of the other examples, people that are, when they don't have access to a full amount of fiber, they start using different materials, they're innovating with designs. So you have all of this very creative adaptation to new and a very different context, which is something that has to be highlighted. I completely agree with you.
That urges for us as researchers or commentators or observers some kind of new understanding of the dynamic or dynamite in the notion of authenticity. Is it the know-how that is authentic, or is it the end product of a certain shape and quality that is authentic? I remember, I don't know if you're familiar with the work by Nikos Papastadiadis, who is sociologist of migration, art, and whatever, diaspora, an Australian scholar, and he was a guest scholar in Malmö, and he gave a lecture starting with some slides, and then it was actually the Museum of Mankind in London having an exhibition of I don't know which parts of the world, it was some kind of masks that you have this slide that were taken from like 15 meters, 10 meters, 5 meters, and then a close-up. So coming closer, and they look perfectly, let's call it some Pacific ritual masks. But then when you came close, you saw that they were all made exclusively out of old knife tissues. And still, that that kind of, and it wasn't an art project. It was like, and in Sweden, some kind of charity chains, very old. They work with particular. You see the person. It could be your key informant. I mean, you see who did it, and so on. And then you have all these kind of traditional objects from Nepal, India, and so on that are sometimes made out of recycled bottles or anyway, pieces of industrial production that are recycled. So it could be opening up for this kind of reading this kind of literature to see what we tell about is authenticity rooted necessarily in place, or is it rooted in know-how?
Yeah, that's a good advice.
Can I allow one more question? And then you can answer all of them together. But one last question? Yes.
Maybe this is a kind of follow-up to Mr. Baso's question. You started mentioning some of the new practices that were emerging by doing these baskets in the new site in Bogota, with the depiction of this child and the woman holding this child. Is there something more, or was this only an exception? Is the practice transforming in the new site and is bringing something new and creating a different sense of home by creating different things?
Yeah, it is completely changing, and it's changing and also remaining in some parts kind of traditional. So, for example, in the use of new materials, there's one artisan that is actually a man, and it's a couple. So his wife generally makes the pieces, and he used to be a jeweler. So he started working with metal threads, and together they're creating these baskets that mix huergue, so this fiber, with metal threads. He's also figuring out new designs, again, based on the Choco landscape. So he now is creating designs on like stars, several mountains. So yes, you have this. And also when we start talking about the craft market, then there's even more examples that come up, because then you have work between Western designers and Wonan indigenous people, and then here other things start appearing. So yes, there are a lot of examples of.
There could be a new sense of home that is not dependent of the original.
Not dependent, I would say, but it keeps connection with it. So it doesn't depend on it, but it does keep connection with it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
So I will stay here because I will introduce Pim Westerkamp. Sorry, I will. Yeah. Well, yeah, you can open. Pim's presentation is called "Home is where the food is: Objects, Longing, and Belonging."
Well, it's slightly changed. I forgot to tell you.
No, okay. Yep, then.
Okay. As Laura said, my name is Pim Westerkamp. I'm one of the two curators of Indonesia in this museum. And I will start immediately because I'm afraid I have too little time. In this paper, I will work on diasporic objects that were used to prepare and serve Indonesian food, both in Indonesia and in Holland. Holland, I specifically use this term as people living in Indonesia during colonial times called the country, this land where we are living, where we are in this moment, not the Netherlands, but Holland. Europeans living in Indonesia consider themselves, and it's according to Wayne, it's a strange term, but I still use it, Netherlandish, and people who lived here were Hollandish, which is completely different. People moved to and from Indonesia and within Indonesia a lot during colonial due to the colonial system. Europeans moved to different places in Indonesia every 3 or 4 years, which is called migration, or they were permitted a leave to Europe, which was travel and hence temporary. Migration and movement have been part of European lifestyle in Indonesia, and so has food. The choice of Indonesian or European food was strongly related to a performance of self, as I will argue in this paper. After Europeans migrated to Holland, Indonesian food and kitchen and tableware became an important part of the so-called migrant worlds. This term, used by Paul, helps to shed light on the interrelatedness of movement of objects and people, how the intersection itineraries of people and things are mutually constitutive. What I hope to do in this paper is to explain how objects that have moved mattered. Although one can argue whether these Europeans form a true diasporic community, but after Paul's talk this morning, I think we can talk about a community in the sense that William Safran is quoted by James Clifford, like Wono did this morning, in his article on diaspora. The diasporic experience is broadly felt within these European families. There's a strong sense of displacements, a very lively memory and a myth about Indonesia that is considered the original homeland, a loss of that homeland that one cannot return to, adaptation to, and yet a sense of not belonging in the new destination, which is Holland. A firm collective identity is less evident here, as the community is highly differentiated. My family experienced these feelings too. I forgot to show you this. Ancestors of both my father and mother started going to Indonesia in the 17th century and settled at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century permanently. So the red route is the route in the until the mid of the 19th century, the yellow route from 1869 onwards, when the Suez Canal was opened, and the blue one, which is actually myself, is the airplane. But I'll not go into the different materialities of the different modes of transportation. All my grandparents left Indonesia in the late 20s, and my parents left the country in 1948. They settled in the town of Alkmaar, which is a very well-known city famous for its cheese market, and it's a typical Hollandish town. People who are born there are called cheeseheads. Hence, I'm a cheesehead. There, my parents had to build a new home, and I think my mother took the lead in this. The layout of our house and the way in which she used it, the massive garden, the enormous amount of animals that were partly tropical, and the number of domestic, all helped her to translate and transform the house to make it resemble the house of her parents and even of her grandparents. So inspired by Paul again, she was a migrant as architect. She turned the house into a home to create a sense of belonging, to compensate a feeling of loss, to hold on to her memory, and this was all fueled by nostalgia. The recreation of the past was also an attempt to recreate the time when she was still happy, when her father, who died when she was 8 years old, was still alive. So she wanted to go back to a place and a time that didn't exist anymore. It was all imagined. Another important translation to create a home was the Indonesian food we had on every Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. It was my father's task, as he would cook the food. This is interesting, as the knowledge and the preparation of food belonged to the women's world in my mother's family. My father learned it from his mother, who was born and bred in the Netherlands and only went to Indonesia after her marriage. Indonesian food became a strong instrument in creating a sense of home and belonging, and not only in my family, but in many families from Indonesia and in diasporic communities in general. The book In Nederland door omstandigheden, which I translate with In the Netherlands due to the occasion, describes the Indo-European community of Alkmaar. People tell about their lives, their loss, and the longing for what once was. My father, my second brother, and myself are also quoted in this book. One chapter is called The Most Important, and it deals with food. People describe food as the most important aspect in their lives, as the culture, the only thing that is left, that connects with the past. In the language of it's a language of hospitality and a symbol of being different. Food is sacred, these people tell. My brother is cited, you can put your own character in the food. And in the case of my father, the writer calls it a passion, a form of magic, an Asian tradition. Stories about Indonesian food, and hence the relation between food and performed self, have always played a role in my family. A well-known family story is that food literally shaped my mother's body. While being... Wait, it's even getting worse. While being pregnant of my mother, my grandmother received a very big load of kepiting, which is crab. She simply adored crab, and so perkadel kepiting, which is a certain dish, was prepared, and she kept on eating this. Her domestic warned her not to do that, as the child might get tangan kepiting, crab hands. My grandmother thought it was just superstition and ignored her. However, my mother was born with a 6th rudimentary finger on her right hand and a lump on her left finger of her left hand. This story is significant as it's telling about the influence of food, and because it mocks with indigenous folk knowledge and also with the people who think lightly about it. One can actually suggest that my grandmother was punished for being or reacting too Hollandish. My grandmother, who wrote her memoirs in the 50s for her grandchildren, started with a telling remark, and I've translated it: which child born in the Indies wasn't raised primarily with rice and chicken, first as nasi tim, which is bain-marie cooked in a hot pot, and later as grown-ups with rice and chicken at the well-known rice table. Her remark shows how growing up in Indonesia is intertwined with food. If you are born and raised in Indonesia, you simply have to eat the local food. As I mentioned earlier, Europeans in Indonesia moved a lot. Before moving, which is also a very aspect of the lifestyle in Indonesia in colonial times, Europeans sold most of their possessions, including kitchenware, at the so-called vendusi or lelang, the auction. So migrating is very much part of the European world in Indonesia, as well as the process of selecting what to keep and what to get rid of. My grandmother wrote about what she kept when leaving for the Netherlands in 1928. We kept the things we considered precious, like beautiful vases, all the silverware and crystal, fine statues, and our paintings and etchings. Of course, I didn't part at all with my linen and doilies. What she didn't mention was the rather big amount of Indonesian objects she took with her. It's most likely that kitchenware, however, was not taken to Holland, as my grandparents expected to be back in Indonesia within the year. However, as I've told, my grandfather died during his leave and my grandmother stayed in Holland. My grandmother had taken the knowledge about the preparation and the serving of Indonesian food to Holland, and the family ate Indonesian food frequently, for which they used Indonesian kitchenware. So now I go on with the materiality of the kitchen. The kitchen in houses in Indonesia was situated traditionally outside the European living quarters. As such, it was the domain of the Indonesian cook and thus an indigenous space. This is reflected by the fact that most of the Indonesian kitchenware was and is still addressed only by its Indonesian name. It was not a space that European women liked. Though some of them cooked Indonesian food themselves occasionally, like my maternal great-grandmother and my grandmother. Two important objects that were taken to Holland were these two cooking books. The first one on the left, the new Complete East Indies cooking book. Recipes for the complete Indies rice table, pickles, pastry, custard, jams, ice cream, with a short appendix for Holland, written by Mrs. Catenius van der Meijden. It consists of a mixture of Indonesian, which is the majority, and European recipes, instructions and adjustments for both Indonesia and Holland. My grandmother got it at St. Nicholas Day in 1914 in Batavia, 7 months after her marriage. It was a gift from her mother, who wrote, "To the dear young housewife from St. Nicholas, Laan de Riemer, December 1914. This remark suggests that my grandmother was going to use it herself. My paternal grandmother actually had the same cooking book. The other cooking book on the left is the cooking book East Indies cooking book, containing more than 800 recipes, again increased and renewed with several recipes for the Dutch and native kitchen. This is a 1950 print, and it belonged to my grandmother and later my mother, who made note in the books. My grandmother, aunt, and mother must have used the books a lot, as they are full of stains, probably from oil and food. The history of cooking in my mother's family can literally be read from the book, as the markings from all the three of them shown in the most popular recipes. Well, here's the recipe of frikadel kepiting, which is the recipe my grandmother ate. This is the writing of my mother, that one of my great-grandmother, and that one of my grandmother. Furthermore, they added remarks about amounts, substitutions, rejections, or recommendation over the years. The majority of the marked recipes are Indonesian ones, not Dutch ones. When my aunt taught me to cook Indonesian food during my puberty, she passed down this book to me. I was actually just supposed to read which ingredients were needed and what steps to take. My aunt taught me to takar, to measure out the amounts of every ingredient just by looking and by smelling. Cooking with exact amounts was not done. She sometimes mentioned that Hollandish people had asked for specific amounts, which she couldn't give. She also learned me how to pronounce the Indonesian words properly, something Hollandish people also failed to do. So in a way, she taught me that this is the way our cooking was done, and that Hollandish people cooked differently. I used this book extensively when I was a student here in Leiden and looked for the most complicated and most elaborate dishes most Hollandish guests wouldn't know. This was to impress them with my skills and to show them the real Indonesian cooking, but also to perform a different self. I have 4 brothers, no sisters. These are the cooking books of my brothers. That one is a renewed book, I'll come back to it later, from the old cooking book I have. Then these 3 cooking books are for my second brother, my third brother, no, my eldest brother, my second brother, my twin brother, my youngest brother. And it is dispersed among the family because Oma Kiesbury was an acquaintance of my father in Yogyakarta. And it are very good cooking books, which is shown by the way they look. They are used very often. This is a cooking book my third brother had and gave it to my twin brother. This is a book my eldest brother also has, and there's still 2 more, and I didn't have time to take the photographs, 2 modern cooking books which my eldest brother and myself also have. Okay, the tumbukan. My father had several Indonesian kitchenwares he cherished, and these were only referred to, as I have mentioned earlier, with their Indonesian names. This one, the tumbukan, is to pound seeds or nuts, and it's a mortar and pestle. The tumbukan is made of andesitic stone, a volcanic rock, a materiality that is telling, as the material is extremely old and is literally from the soil of Java. It's connected to volcanoes that are considered sacred on Java. Especially the area around Muntilan in central Java is known for its production of kitchenware and of volcanic rock, So the tumbukan makes a direct connection between the island of Java, where the food is originally produced, and the Indonesian dishes that are reproduced in the Netherlands. The stone is very hard, which gives the object a hardness and a surliness. It's very resistant, and it hardly changes. It's symbolic for the way the food has to be prepared. You cannot change the way it has to be done. A new tumbukan feels very rough and is not yet worn. My aunt and mother taught me to rub new ones with oil before using it to prevent the stone of taking too much of the taste of the spices. The object has its own agency as it forces you to use it often. Only by using it a lot, it becomes worn and it feels very smooth. Slowly it becomes yours. You have worked on it for many, many years. It's a proof of the many times that it has been used, and it's proof that you've cooked Indonesian food a lot. Let me go to this one first. My third brother, Ruud, recently confirmed this analysis. When I asked him to send me a picture of his mortar, he sent me 2 pictures. This was the last picture of the pestle with the text, "And look how worn, yes?" Actually, for the Dutch people, when I asked him to read the text to me, he said, "Kijk hoe versleten, ja?" So he pronounced it in the Creole language. So he asked my affirmation that he has well used it and it was worn. So he wanted to show me that he's a real good traditional cook using the mortar and not the kitchen machine. So when sending me this WhatsApp, a modern way of corresponding, at the same time he's bonding with part of our heritage. And these are the mortars of my eldest brother, my second brother, my third brother. This one is myself. This one is my youngest brother, who got it from my parents. And this one is a wooden one which belonged to my aunt and is now in the possession of my youngest brother as well. My father's tumbukan is extremely smooth, and that gives it a kind of softness and tenderness. When I'm using it, I imagine that there's continuity. I am copying my father in many ways. The pounding of the seed and the nuts, the lovingly preparing of the food, the looking forward to the taste, and the delight of eating it. I often feel the tumbukan and I smell it. The touch and the smell are traces of former use and make a connection with the past, to Indonesia, to my family, to my parents, and to my youth. The touch and smell make connection between the object and the body, which is shown in yet another way. The object has a specific shape. The depth of the mortar and the shape of the pestle are important. If you want to use it for the first time, people may ask you, does it cocok? Does it suit you? Is it fitting for your hand? For sure, my father's tumbukan, this one, is fitting for my hand. It's extremely cocok. Within 1 minute, I have pounded the seeds into powder because it completely fits my hand. I have yet another tumbukan, of which the pestle is much larger and it doesn't fit my hand and it's less worn. If I use that one, it will take me much more time to have the same results. So it's kurang cocok. It doesn't fit me that well. And to make a small connection with this morning, these are all the mortars and pestles in the museum collection. And they're all from about the 1930s. The materiality of the table. This is the dining table of my great-grandmother, and here's my grandmother. The dining table had a special place in the 19th century colonial houses. It was situated at the back gallery, so the more private part of the house. It contrasted with the kitchen, the Indonesian space, because this was the European space, even if the food was Indonesian. So the majority of the objects only have a Dutch name. In the 19th and early 20th century, Europeans had the choice of either eating European or Indonesian food, and in my family, both was done. When my grandfather, who was born and bred in Holland, came to meet his future parents-in-law in Batavia for the first time in 1913, Indonesian food was served. When he asked for sugar and butter to eat with his rice, my great-grandmother, as the story goes, replied, "Young man, if you ask that one more time, then you can go and you will never be welcome here again." This story signifies that my grandmother and her parents had firmly situated in Indonesia, and that my grandfather was a newcomer, a totok. It underlines the cultural difference between my grandmother and my grandfather. So the table was also a place where social and also cultural selves were negotiated and a battlefield of contrasting selves. The same can be said from our own dinner table. It was the place where my parents laid out their indie selves in multiple ways. I'll come back later to that. One of the most important objects on the table is the rice spoon for serving rice. It can never be used for anything else. My parents actually had two. One for the usual family dinners during the weekend, and one silver one, which was old, a family heirloom, this one, that came from the Westerkamp family. My Aunt Els had exactly the same rice spoon, a heirloom from my great-grandparents Eugenius, on the top. The old rice spoon was rarely used as official dinner parties serving Indonesian food in the 50s and 60s was rare. My parents, like my grandparents, would serve mostly European food. That changed in the 70s when my parents started to organize slamatans, ceremonial Indonesian meals when moving houses for birthdays or other festivities. The Indonesian rice table replaced the European food, and my father's cooking became famous. How much time do I have? Okay. Then there are multiple reasons for this change. The first reason might be that my parents became more confident in performing their cultural selves. According to my elder brothers, who are 10 and 9 years older, my father faced subtle forms of discrimination in the late 40s and the 50s because of his background. A second reason might be better availability of fresh Indonesian ingredients. And a third reason was the involvement of my mother in the organizing of Indies fairs and parties in the late 60s. These open displays of Indies culture in Alkmaar within the Indo-European community made our family much more submerged in Indies and Indonesian culture. A final reason might have been the more direct contact with Indonesian culture. My parents visited Indonesia in 1970, 1975, and in 1980 with me. This had a big impact on both of them. And besides that, in 1976, I went to Leiden University to study Indonesian languages and cultures, and in 1977, I started learning Javanese court dances at the Indonesian embassy. All this empowered their sense of their Indies culture, their connection to Indonesia, but also their Dutchness. The family rice spoon now became an important object for the slamatan and the Indonesian dinners that my parents organized. This was the rightful spoon to be used when cutting the tumpeng, a mountain of yellow rice. When I was very young, we would never have a tumpeng. Only after I got acquainted with the role of tumpeng at ceremonies at Indonesia, we started making tumpeng. It very quickly became a sign of traditional Indonesian food and an instrument to differentiate with people who were not familiar with the tumpeng. So this is my eldest brother, this is me, this is my third brother, and then there are two brothers left who had no spoon, and they are going to, no, I'm not going to. And so they asked me to buy a spoon in Yogyakarta, which was the town my father had lived. So I bought my two brothers a spoon from Yogyakarta. And those are practically the same spoons as those two in the museum collection. In 1984, my father celebrated a jubilee with his family and dearest friends. I had made a tumpeng, but because of lack of skills, the shape was not very beautiful yet. The party was held in Amsterdam, and the silver spoon, for whatever reason, was not used. A wooden spoon, as you can see, was used instead. And for those who are doubting, yes, that's me. Later, the silver spoon became a prime object for the slamatans. Only with this heirloom, a slamatan could be organized and became authentic. Especially at the commemoration slamatans in honor of my parents and aunt. These were held on specific days after their passing away. My father was the first to die in 1990, and on his 100th day, we organized a slamatan in the house of my eldest brother. My mother used the rice spoon, and it was also used for the slamatan on the day of her own funeral. So here you see my mother with the silver rice spoon and a tumpeng which has already much more the shape of a real tumpeng. We also had a tumpeng used on the slamatan on the day of her funeral to celebrate the last day that the whole family came together in her house. And the shape of the tumpeng became more and more authentic. Here again with the shape. My eldest brother inherited the spoon of the Gugenius family. I already told that story. I can skip that. The use of the spoon spanned at least 5 generations in our family. It connects us with the past in Indonesia, thus having a temporal and spatial significance. Because it functions with meaningful ceremonies, the function of the spoon as a family heirloom grew, and it became a way of life. To conclude, so what does these diasporic objects tell us, and why do they matter? Precisely because they are diasporic objects that are taken with the family, at least the books and the spoons. The mortar has become a diasporic object because of its role in Holland. It didn't move with the family, probably, but it supplies a continuity. The food, kitchen, and tableware connects my parents and grandmother to a lost homeland. It helped them to mediate, as James Clifford put it, the experience of separation and entanglement of living in Holland and remembering Indonesia, what Paul already showed this morning as well. For me, it's a connection to my maternal and paternal grandparents, and even to my great-grandparents. The cooking books signify appropriation and perhaps even expropriation, as it's indigenous knowledge literally translated and made available as an instrument of domination. It's actually interesting to tell that the very first cooking book in Indonesia was called Kitab Masak, so it was written in Indonesian. The front page of the second cooking book that I have is especially revealing. You see how damaged the book is, but on the front page of the second cooking book, it shows a fragment of a Dutch lady in sarung kabaya pointing to an Indonesian domestic on the right. It seems like ordering. It's telling, like my other research material, about the relations between Indonesians and Europeans. And also this 2002 book is telling as well, because it's the most important one is highlighted. The less important one, with the Wajam, is at the background. And she's only a shadow. The rice spoon is also an example of appropriation, as it's an Indonesian object made for the European table. The decoration and the shape are European, and the material increases a social status. Thus, they are also reminders of the complicated relations of the colonial past. My mother's family, Dutch family, cherished that period, but for my father's family, that was different. My Indo-European grandfather could not study and had a modest career. His wife, who was a Totok, had no fond memories of her life in Indonesia and of her in-laws. Yet only 2 days ago, it's very true, my cousin told me that she had a cooking book from our grandmother, my paternal grandmother, the Totok woman, who married my grandfather, and that she used it in the Netherlands to cook Indonesian food. So even for her, it was important to prepare Indonesian food, and she taught that to her son, my father. The food and these objects provide my family with an escape from the Hollandish surroundings. They help in performing a specific self and create a sense of home and belonging. When I'm interviewing my brothers about the past, they somehow all end up talking about Indonesian food. Indonesian food is a very essential part in our upbringing, and it's connected to our youth, the house we are raised in, and the time when our parents were still alive. Although it may provide a comforting sense of continuity and continued association, it is at the same time highly imagined. We will never be able to go back to the beginning, to the origins, as that no longer exist, like the other talkers has told this morning. My last picture shows, however, that this desire stays alive. One of my nieces posted a picture of her son on the WhatsApp of the family with the text, "First Indonesian meal, it's a fact." Thank you. Well, in Indonesia, do you have another hour? No, there are people saying that is a Dutch invention, but the way of serving it, with a lot of servants, with a dish on each hand, that may be a Dutch invention. But for example, West Sumatra food is served with rice, and then you get, in a restaurant, you get a lot of small plates from which you can pick. And actually, the concept of Indonesian food is that you have something dry and wet, something sweet, something sour, something hot, something mild. And so you have to combine all these different tastes. And if people would come to my parents and would put everything around the rice and then start mixing it and eating it, then my mother stayed very polite, too polite. She would never invite these people again because they were too Hollandish. Only Hollandish people do this because we know we have stampot in the Netherlands. So, Hannah.
I happened to be last month for the first time in Indonesia, and I was in Semarang, in Toko Un, which goes back to 1936, and it's the granddaughter who still keeps it. And there they had on the counter, they served huzarensalade, for example, which is Dutch, I think. And they also had on the counter of the sweet pies, the kaasstengels, Jan Hagel.
No, it's not kaasstengels, it's kastengel.
Kastengel.
With one A, not two.
Kastengel, thank you. And speculaas, and so all sorts of Dutch cookies. Do you see a parallel in what you told about this in the Netherlands and that in Indonesia?
Well, a lot of Indonesian cooks had to learn how to cook European food as well, and it became a signifier for a certain status, European food. And so in Indonesia you can still have poffertjes, macaroni skotel, huzarensalade, and well, I'm not sure whether they have a real word for ontbijtkoek. But yeah, but there's a parallel because the tastes are not the same. So I have Indonesian nieces, and they will never buy speculaas in Indonesia because they say it's not like the speculaas from Holland. It's a bit like your story. They know the taste from the speculaas from Holland, so they don't like the speculaas in Indonesia because it's a slightly different flavor. I'll come back to you, Wim.
Well, sort of a reversed example, in the television show Heel Holland Bakt, which is like a competitive baking show in the Netherlands.
It's the UK, is it as well?
Yeah, right. But this one is in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
And it was an episode on typically Dutch food, and one of the things they were asked to make was spekkoek. So I thought it was quite interesting how it had become apparently.
Yeah, well, I hadn't time to explain, but there was this restaurant Dorius in Amsterdam, which is the most, well, in the 80s and 90s, was the most famous Dutch restaurant. And I always regret not taking a photograph, but this was the time when there were no cell phones yet. There was a menu hanging outside in the 80s, in the late 80s, and it says the first main course was erwtensoep, pea soup, and the second one was saté van kip met stokbrood. Kebab from chicken with French bread. And so nasi goreng, spekkoek, and chicken kebab have become extremely Dutch. Yes. Wim.
I was intrigued by your last translation of this last slide where you said first Indonesian meal.
Did I say, no, it's on my paper it says Indies meal. Here it says Indies meal.
And how would you then, in your whole fascinating presentation, which left us all hungry, how would you feel that in your family people navigated their identity and their self between Indonesian, Eurasian, even European, but the Netherlands not being...
Yeah, no, it makes sense, this question, but it's a bit difficult because the word Indies you can't really translate into English. Indies could signify Indo-European or something from the past. And for example, I'm raised with an Indiese father and a Dutch mother. And later, when Indies became too ethnic and too racist, Indies became a word for everything from the colonial time. Hence, my parents are both Indies. And there is actually a distinction between Indies food and Indonesian food. When my Javanese nieces came over to Holland, they actually taught me to cook very much simpler than the dishes in my grandmother's cooking book. Sometimes I only use garlic instead of all these complicated recipes. But in my, for those of you who don't know, I'm working on my dissertation, and I try to avoid the word Indies as a country or the Netherlands Indies as much as possible, and only using contemporary terms, which makes it complicated. But it was, on my paper, it said, first Indies meal is a fact. Wayne.
Thanks. Actually, it's a lovely presentation. I'm actually quite jealous because to see someone trace a genealogy so long back with documents.
That's, by the way, my co-promote.
It's amazing. But I want to ask you two things. First of all, going back to what Paul said earlier about the threat of nostalgia. Because your narrative is one that is invested in the idea of selves, but a nostalgic self. Is there a way that you can do this project without it having to be so imbued with this nostalgia?
Yeah, that's the complicated thing for myself as well, because it's not only that I can trace the genealogy 7 generations and even longer back, but that I have 7 generations of people writing about Indonesia. It's a very lucky position I'm in. But that's only my mother's family, so that Dutch family. And yes, my father is the stereotype Indo-European man who didn't talk a lot. So he didn't tell a lot either. But that had also to do with him being raised by a Totok mother who didn't like her Indo-European in-laws at all, to say the least. And yes, I was brought up with this sense of nostalgia, and I have this discourse and of narrative, and I'm not even sure whether it's true, that my mother would always talk about the Netherlands Indies, and my father would never use that word. He would always say Indonesia. But I've been thinking about this as well, because is it nostalgia of this distant place and distant time, or is it also I've mentioned it several times, or is it also this longing for when you are young, which may be pathological, like you said, but I really have to think about it, because it's, especially in the case of my mother, she left Indonesia when she was 8, and yes, she always talked about this beautiful country, big house and big gardens, but it's also the time when her father was still alive. And when she arrived in the Netherlands, he died, although he was born and raised here, he died because of the cold. He got pneumonia and he was dead, but it was the cold. So my mother, for 50 years, she lived in the Netherlands and always was cold. She was always cold because it was a cold country, and maybe it was also metaphorically a cold country, but for her it was a cold country. So, of course, there's this nostalgia, but I shouldn't wipe out the possibility that there are other longings as well for her parents, for example.
Just here's a suggestion, because there's this book by Svetlana Bohm, where she does 2 different ideas of what nostalgia can be. That might be useful. The other thing that I found nice is the sensualness of your presentation. There's a certain...
I was thinking of taking the tumbukan with me, because but then it's heavy. It's heavy. No, I didn't say it, but it's really erotic to feel the inside of the tumbukan.
We saw it. It was clear. But the question is, how do you also think that through, the kind of sensuality of the materials, and how you because you're articulating with them in a quite physical way.
No, but it is physical because it's hard. I mean, if you put coriander seeds and cumin seeds in the tumbukan, it's really hard work to get it done in a minute. And it's I have been using the kitchen machine sometimes, but yes. I have to admit it. But I think I said to Wim that I'm still doubting, to Maya, I think, that if you use the kitchen machine, it becomes perfectly smooth powder, but there you don't control the consistency of the result. Whereas if you do it by hand, you can completely control the consistency of the result. Peter.
Can you say, just because I'm curious, but also because it is a comparative issue, can you say something about the rise and fall of the Chinese-Indonesian restaurant in the Netherlands? Because it is connected to, say, the history of the Dutch in Indonesia, right? And it's coming to the Netherlands.
Yeah, but there were also...
History,
there were also
happens to the Chinese and the Indonesian.
Yeah, but there were also Chinese directly traveling to the Netherlands, and so I'm not so familiar with the start of the Chinese restaurants. But a couple of years ago, there were 2 books which were published in the Netherlands: Buku Kita and Buku. I forgot the other name. And there are compilations of family recipes, and I wrote a introduction on the book about food and about the role the food played in my family. And in the weekends my father had to work, which would happen every 5 or 6 weeks. My father couldn't cook, so we went to the Chinese restaurant in Alkmaar. But it was forbidden by my mother to choose anything that reminded of Indonesian food. I'm a bit ashamed, but my mother would say, they can't cook Indonesian food. So we had to choose Chinese food. That was all right, but not Indonesian food. And if people ask me, what's a good Indonesian restaurant in Amsterdam? To be very frankly, I would hardly know, because I never go to an Indonesian restaurant. Like my father, I'm a better cook than most restaurants. And there are some people who can testify that in this room.
Yeah.
Paul?
Just a very quick question, and again, I don't know the subtleties of the language, but I was really struck by what you were saying about the Indies and the Indonesian, these categories, because I mean, what strikes me is that, yes, you've described this homeland, which is precisely this colonial construct, and what you were describing in terms of the elaborateness of the specific recipes in these books, which presumably is a kind of a hybrid kind of...
not all of them, but
yeah.
Part of them, yes.
It just struck me as the temporal nature of this homeland, that it existed all the time. There was this colonial context, and of course there's clear parallels, most obviously with Indian cooking in Britain, which there was that famous thing some years ago that we had described an English or a British dish, and curry is what comes up. But no, it was particularly that notion of which does kind of challenge our assumptions that homeland in this case was a temporal homeland of a colonial context.
Yeah, that's true. By the way, it's interesting that you say curries as a last remark. I'm looking at historical travel stories and travel books, and a lot of people constantly write that they had curry at local Javanese people, or heads, I mean. And I was always surprised, why do they keep on mentioning curry all the time? Because that's not particular Indonesian food. Until I really had a proper look at the two old cooking books. They're full of recipes of curry, of chicken, beef, lamb, etc. And so that must somehow have changed at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, that other dishes became more favorite. But in the 19th century, it was a lot of curry. Okay?
So I think we'll go to a coffee break now on group 4, and then we'll come back for the roundtable conversation.
And then we go to dinner with Pete.
No. Of Indonesian or whatever. So how do we break out of that? Do we need to break out of that? Those affordances, in the morning, Paul might have thought that I was being critical of his presentation, but it wasn't so. I actually thought that affordances might actually get us out of the bind. It might afford us the possibility of saying, yes, working with Ghanaians, with Ghanaian object is good, but it is only one possibility of working. And we can work in multiple other ways with the objects, because those objects gives us diverse possibilities. I'm still struggling with what are the politics that inhere in that, though, and what might that mean differently. The other presentation, Maya, which I really liked, and which I wanted to also complicate away, is her notion of the mundane, everyday, banal things. Actually, one of the things that we shouldn't tell everybody or tell anybody, but actually museums' collections are one ton load of banal, everyday, mundane things. We actually have much more banal, everyday things than we have the what I call the deep culture things. Those deep things which forces people into being traditional. We have a lot of banal spears and things like that. So the question then is if through the migration framework, the diasporic framework, we can also think of these banal, everyday things more complexly and what they might mean in an articulation with society. Today we struggled with nostalgia We struggled with always looking back, what in the Netherlands might be called Temple Dulu. We struggle with this idea that objects always kind of, objects from the past at least, kind of drag us back into a pastness, which is not always the case, should not always be the case. But probably Vonu's presentation suggests something else, as she suggests that the Waka, even though it is deeply embedded in history and deeply embedded in our pastness, is actually complexly entangled in our present negotiations that are happening between museums and diverse communities. So perhaps nostalgia is not the only way of doing it. All of this, actually, and we didn't tell you this, and we didn't even say this in the beginning to Laura, but all of this was a starting point now, because at the end of this year, our annual conference, which will be on the 29th and 30th of November, will try to again think through these complex things, the relationship between migration, mobilities, objects, and the complex politics of heritage. So this was you gave us a gem to be able to think about another moment. And I wanted to tell you that Ghassan Haj is actually coming here and probably will be a part of that conference later on as well. So what were the things that came up for you? What are the things that we need to take into account as we move forward with this topic? And what will you take away, Laura, to be able to finish your PhD in much more complex and exciting ways? Or what will you just brush aside as not useful? I want to open up for the possibility of questions and contestations. Say anything that comes to your mind. If you found a presentation boring, it's also okay. What came up that you think needs to be pushed a little further? Javier. You have many things.
What interests me about the diasporic objects is not as much as they connect the people to the home country or to a kind of origin, but what is the impact in the host country? So what does it mean for the Netherlands to have Indonesian country as typically Dutch? Or what is the impact of having the canoes in the Netherlands, and what does it mean for the Netherlands? How the Netherlands, the host country, changes. So it's part of the diasporic object, but it's maybe the part that we have look at the less, yeah, and that perhaps needs attention.
Nice. First, yes?
I'm actually connecting to this because I thought, wouldn't it have been interesting to ask people who affiliate or feel that they're affiliated to Ghanaian origins, but also ask some other people who are affiliated to other origins to look at the same objects and to see what it means to them. Did you do it, or do you plan to do such things? I mean, that would be an interesting thing to see, because for whom are these? If we conceptualize some objects in the depots of the different museums as diasporic, for whom, you know, why? Yeah, what is possible to do with different audiences, or do we, per definition, see audiences as different, or do we open up for, yeah, different cross interpretations or common interpretations or very different interpretations that have nothing to do with particular origins of people, perceived origins of people? Yeah.
To speak to Javier, I will say to you that is a great point for yet another reasons, because one of the projects, the project that the Ghana project is about, is called Connecting Diasporas. And the idea of connecting diasporas is exactly to ask not only what does the object itself do in the Netherlands, on the Netherlands, but to tie that to the people who also are here and not there. So if you think about the two diasporas together, then you also think that they operate in this moment. And then it becomes very difficult not to think them very politically. Very difficult, which is fine, yes. And to answer your question, well, Rita will answer that question, because she did the project.
I didn't do it alone, though. We did it together with Imagine IC, which is an organization.
Right here. Danielle, yeah.
Over there. But we actually did not ask people, we did not say, well, are you Ghanaian Dutch? We just said, well, we want to highlight the fact that Ghana was last year, Ghana was 6 years of independence for Ghana, and we want to highlight that. So to link to that, we said, well, who does feel any connection, and it doesn't matter whether you or your parents were born or raised or whatever in Ghana. So actually there was quite a diverse group of people, which was also very interesting, and therefore the whole idea of what is a community was also very interesting and very problematic. And also I think that made the whole project way more interesting, and also that there were so many different ideas of what Ghana was or is, and for different ethnic Ghanaian groups, but also for different generations, and for Surinamese Dutch people, Afro-Surinamese, not Afro-Surinamese, so it was super diverse. So we really tried to highlight that and problemize that as well.
And I think that actually Paul, one of the things that came out with Daniela, you can correct me, and this is one of the things that happens especially within certain diasporic communities, that I was standing there, and I never stand anywhere as a Jamaican, but I was standing there as a Jamaican in that audience. And it was funny to hear somebody who thought himself Rastafari, who was so Rastafari, more than any Jamaican could be. I was like, whoa. But also that the Surinamese young people were sometimes even more passionately Ghanaian than the Ghanaians. So actually, the object became kind of like a complex place where all of these things are negotiated, which is longing, which is some imagination, whatever. And so we see that as well when you place the object in the middle, that it doesn't always map out in the same way that you think it is going to map out. Especially when... What's that? No, yeah, but that's exactly when somebody points out. I was in London doing in a hairdresser, and there was this hairdresser who was Jamaican who says she loves to have Africans coming to her hairdresser to do their locks, because then she tells them how they should be African. Now she's Jamaican who lived in Germany, right? But she knows how they should be African.
Yeah, I guess just following on from that, I think it's very two things really, and I picked up the critique that you made in your paper about the laziness of saying the Ghanaian, the Sierra Leonean, the whatever it might be, diaspora community, and indeed the problematization of this notion community. So yes, I do think affordances are a way to open that up, because in some senses it's about recognizing the multiple affordances, the positionalities, the way in which affordances arise out of particular situations. However, there's two things I think about why one might target the Ghanaian community. Sorry, it's just a short, and that was my second point about shorthands. But so the first point would be about recognizing the history of these collections and whose voices were heard. So it's all very well saying, okay, well, we're not going to prioritize Sierra Leoneans with Sierra Leonean collections. Let's talk to, person off the street. All right, because that's what we've been doing for 100 years or more, saying, well, the Sierra Leoneans can't talk to their own culture. So, by saying, well, we're not going to prioritize Sierra Leonean voices, for instance, there's a whole politics to doing that, to saying, well, this is just perpetuating saying, well, actually, someone from Lambeth, probably that's not a good choice, but someone from Devon can talk about the Sierra Leonean object better than a Sierra Leonean person. But it's absolutely this essentialization of identity which we're trying to undo as well. The other point I wanted to make was much more a pragmatic one, which is why is it that museums so often go to the organized Ghanaian, society in Amsterdam or the Sierra Leonean group and thing, and it's basic pragmatic thing is that it's actually very difficult to do the kind of ethnographic research that you've been doing over how long a period have you been? 20 years. Because actually most projects, and sorry to me, this is a banal kind of commentary, but it's actually the reality of what we're working with, is to say, well, okay, we've got funding for a year for this project, which is working on the affordances, let's say, of these collections. We need to get a cross-section of views here, but we mustn't certainly exclude, let's say, Sierra Leoneans with this Sierra Leonean collection. What do? We go and find the most visible. So I think it's in terms of turning the nice theoretical discussions and so on that we'd have in a kind of a forum such as this, to actually how do we then bring this into museum practice, and then we hit that problem, and it's a very a matter of pragmatism. And in a way, that's what that kind of museum affordance project, the bigger question, is indeed thinking of toolkits in a way for how do you translate these kinds of conversations into something that you can actually apply in the everyday in a museum context with the constraints that we generally work in. Mm-hmm. So I think that's an important thing, because we are talking about how do we change practice. To
right, yeah.
Engage with these issues.
First, Dineke, and then Martin.
Yes, I have two things. I think it might be time to throw in the concept that Imagine I See also develops about communities of emotions, or feeling attachments to certain heritages. Perhaps you can elaborate on that a little, I don't know. But the other thing is, when you talked about the impact of the diasporic objects in the society, my question came back from before, which had actually for you. You said that the waka, one of the determining the object as a diasporic object would be that it would never really belong there. And I would like to question that. Why would that be? Why could the waka never be, belong?
Well, I think it very much depends on the viewpoint you take. And I think from a viewpoint of the diasporic community, Maori community in Europe, it very much belongs here. Because that's the way it makes them Maori, actually. It makes them feel more Maori, and also empowers them to be able to kind of connect the worlds they live in, and they go between without really much difficulty, but still a way to also teach their children. So it's for them it's very important to be able to show their children that is also part of their children's identity, this being Maori. I think for the viewpoint of Toi Maori, for example, they take a very much more kind of traditionalist standpoint, a viewpoint. So they, for them, I think it's almost important for them to have this waka as something that doesn't completely belong, because if it would completely belong, it would make the effort not really worth doing, I think. So you have to have this kind of difference, especially from the standpoint of Toi Maori. And then I think for Njord, it's something that is something on top of their Njord identity, because Njord people, they are members of this rowing club. And it's only a small group of people that actually commit to being associated with the waka and all the protocols that are associated with it. So it's more, for them it's more of an addition to their being a Njord member than to being something that doesn't quite fit in. It's something that it comes on top of it.
Yes, Martin, it goes to Martin. I wanted to do two things, because one of the things that I felt that was missing from the discussion, because diaspora is as a citizenship practice, is actually belongs in a set of terms which is very much emotional. It is an emotional, it is an emotional term, what some scholars call emotional citizenship. So I was interested that didn't come up. Vonu said something which was brilliant earlier, and I wanted to go back to it when she said it ties actually to the kind of things of what you call that, remittances, when you said that the object, them going to achieve something. So the objects actually go out to achieve something. And the achievement, in many ways, actually ties, in many ways, to certain kind of obligations, certain kind of gifting and what responsibilities you have in terms of gifting. So I think that actually is a beautiful, beautiful statement that we need to hold on to in this conversation. One of the things before Martin comes, I want to go back to that we need to get back to the idea of the economics that you mentioned. So I want to get back to that. Martin.
There's a couple of things going through my mind, none of which I can probably explain coherently. So forgive me for lack of sleep, not being able to do that. Go ahead. So one is that because several people have talked about the blurring of identities, not being essentialist, etc. And I loved how your talk, I'm sorry, I don't about the Letizia Museum brought out the necessity of strategic essentialism for a lot of people in political struggles. As much as we would want to be, you know, blend these identities and show that we're not essentialists, etc., there's a large discrepancy between what we would like to do at the museum and I think is necessary within a progressive project versus what people on the ground need in terms of being essentialist about their identity and able to create a space for themselves. And that goes for indigenous peoples in the Amazon as much as it goes for diaspora here in Holland, I think. Another thing which I thought was interesting came from Wonu's presentation where she said that Toi Maori was very hesitant about including the London-based group in ceremonies with or activities around the waka because that's exactly the same thing we see or I see here as well with Surinamese communities, for example, where the people who have moved from Suriname, especially indigenous communities, who have moved from Suriname to Holland are seen as a diaspora which doesn't really have the right to speak because they left in 1975 when stuff became difficult in Suriname. So there's also a very big tension between, you know, the people who stay, the people who go, and the way that, you know, then when they get here, they are marginalized in a million different ways, and then feel that, like you say, Wayne, Surinamese people suddenly feel the need to be more Ghanaian than the Ghanaian people because that carves out the space for themselves, which comes back to the strategic essentialism part. And then the last thing I wonder about is how do we treat these objects as diasporic objects if we don't have the diaspora here in Holland? So, for example, for Surinamese objects, this is easy. For Moroccan objects, for Turkish objects, for Ghanaian objects. For example, these Tucano pieces we have at the Trope Museum, you know, they are diasporic objects in a way, I guess, but the diaspora of the Tucano are not in Holland. So what does that mean for those objects and the way we engage with them? Yeah. I think that's it.
No, there is nobody to answer that, and I could do that, but I'm not so sure. I'd like to, for Martin's last point, that's an important point as well for museum in a more pragmatic way, because if you know the amount of funding that museums get, especially in the UK, for example, for source community work, right, for working with particular diasporic groups, then what you realize is that many people complain that because the group from this region in the Pacific is not big, then there is not really that much money to do work with them. So what does that mean? But if you think about what Vonu said, that these objects go to do a particular work, which is not necessarily tied up to a community having to be there, then the question would be, what work do they go to do? What kind of work, whether or not it is in knowledge transfer, in this, in that, they might have different kind of work rather than just being there for the remittance work or the work in the center itself. Could be for the periphery, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interest. I think there's interesting to think about what you were describing in your presentation, which is very much like a diplomatic gift kind of thing, which is reciprocated and so on like that, doing that. And the collections that are a legacy of another politics, you know, which is the bulk of what we have in the museum, but that doesn't restrict it. So thinking through the remittance metaphor, and these are just metaphors to think with ultimately, and what kinds of values can return if we give ourselves the obligation to regard them as gifts, or even stolen gifts, you know, that even regardless of how they were appropriated or collected or found themselves to where they are, we nevertheless have an obligation attached to them, which is an obligation to the objects, which, as others have mentioned, you know, we're very good at in terms of looking after things, but also an obligation to that originary place and the return of value. So the reciprocation, whether it's written into the agreement, as it were, as in that kind of case, or not. You know, I think that's where we have to take the initiative to say, you know, to address in terms of that repair you were talking about to begin with, where we have to acknowledge the context in which these things were collected.
Yeah. And after Peter, we're going back to that because I still want to hold on to a few things you said. Yes,
well,
Peter.
Paul just actually
answered what you.
Of what I wanted to say out of my mouth.
That's good.
It's good. But I think it's surprising that it's only now in Paul's comment that the notion of gift comes up, because one of the things that struck me most was in Wonu's stories about the fact that the waka is basically an object that is meant to create and maintain a relationship. Right? That is what gifts do. That is actually, if you want to define gifts, then you very quickly end up talking about maintaining relationships, right? Rather than saying this is someone's property or this is something that somebody has paid for. I think one of the wonderful things, and this is really meant to push the point of what to do in an ethnographic museum very much forward. What I found really wonderful is in Wonu's talk again. It was this reflection on notions like ownership, authority, and access. I think one of the interesting things that we do nowadays with material culture, especially when we talk about heritage, is that we disconnect notions of ownership, of possession, and of access, right? The fact that you own the thing no longer means that you actually possess it or that you actually have access to it. The fact that you are the rightful person to have access to a thing doesn't mean that you actually possess it or own it, etc., etc., etc. It's a very important and interesting topic to discuss, and you know, it means that we've already moved away quite extensively from the classical idea of museums owning certain objects in a kind of custody for others, because that would, to some extent, deny the relationship, right? Especially if you think of that ownership in terms of, you know, classical 19th century ideas of the museum as an encyclopedic institution that has a complete collection of everything that you might want to know, right? So the important thing about the relationship part is also that we change the temporalities of this. And one thing, partly in response to Martin, is once you talk about strategic essentialism, it means you're talking about identities for the future, right? Not necessarily identities from a past. Not even identities in the present, although they are clearly indispensable in a way. But strategic essentialism is essentialism that means to achieve something that is not yet there. So my proposal would be to think much more systematically in terms of maintaining and creating relationships and the futures that you see in front of you, that in which those relationships will be productive.
I think that's a nice, because with Martin's point, one of the things that I've always asked myself, the question with the critique of community, which I understand as the critique, as a good critique, and I also started to come to that critique after reading that book, the Purple Book, about Southall in London. the Dutch anthropologist who wrote on about culture. And so he was very critical of the term as well.
Gert Bauman.
Yeah, Bauman, yeah. But my interest has always been, going back to what Martin said, as a museum, do I tell a group that they don't have that they are not a community? Do I tell them that they don't have a heritage? Do I tell them that they don't have identity? Or do I use the objects as a site to which to interrogate these concepts? I don't think that it is for us to tell them that that doesn't exist. It is to rather suggest to push the boundaries of what this might mean for how we think about how these things are mobilized in the present, and how objects also participate in that in certain ways. And some contested objects, Benin bronze, you know, the iconic, or the simple things as well, a basket. So the different forms of object. I want to just go back to this idea of the economic, and I really want to go back to it for a difficult reason. And I'm challenging you here because I'm interested in the. It goes actually back to these, or not just the economy. It goes back to your presentation, because in your presentation there is a sense in which one pushes against the kind of reductive narratives that animate Europe now around questions of migrants and migrancy, right? Yeah. And difference. As difference, right? And one pushes against that. So my question to you would be, in a way, how do you do that work while still acknowledging the politics, the definite, ongoing, massive politics for which many of these migrants, as different, are struggling with in the present? Because a lot of the political narrative surrounding Europe today is the narrative of difference. So how do we acknowledge the nuances of the elite, which is what you're studying, or the refugee, which is not necessarily, without attending as well to the deep politics of differentiation, which happens also within the same politics? Yeah.
Before I kind of elaborate on this, what do you mean by elite?
You said you studied the middle class, did you say?
No. I said that it was also informed by my research on highly skilled, because when
highly skilled, right,
highly skilled refugees who are, well, depending on
on
work permits and contract nature, they're not
elite.
In a very happy ship, all of them, depending on where they come from. I mean, so no. I just said that it's also informing my what I see, because when you pose the same questions to migrants of different socioeconomic backgrounds and so then you can see what they do have in common.
Yeah.
So that was only yeah. And as I said, I mean, refugees who came practically yesterday, of course, are in a totally different position than the migrants, the transnational migrants that I was talking about. Mm-hmm. And indeed, I tried to kind of really depict the background that my research is kind of to be seen against, because it is the migration research in Sweden and this this heritage of seeing migrants as problem that we should help them to integrate. Okay, so difference is not only in the most recent political sense, like position, like, and difference today is not any difference in Sweden, in Western Europe, in the Western world. It's the religious difference of people coming from particular part of the world. So there are many migrants who are not visible as such. So it's particular fears and particular delineation of difference that is problematic, whereas many other differences are not so problematic, as we know. But what I want to mention here, that again, I'm not working in or for or with museums directly, but there is this initiative, and now it seems that something will come about. There is a national museum of migration to be established in Malmö, which is the migrant town in southern Sweden, or the most known as a town of immigration in Sweden. And some pre-studies, pilot studies have been made, and civil society is involved, and all these different groups, but it's much broader than just ethnic or diasporic associations. And it's done by the people in the cultural sector in the town. And now we are in all these kind of round tables and, you know, like, how do we do this, and who is going to be represented and how. So what I'm saying here, and this is also an important context that I have in mind when promoting my ideas here, I would never say that communities don't exist. They exist in a myriads of ways, and of course they're extremely important politically, emotionally, whatever you want, however you want to see it. But I'm much more interested in communities of practice than in communities that are based on some kind of ideas of elites within these circles. Okay, and then again excluding a lot of people because they're not adhering to particular cultural projects. And of course I do understand the constraints of particular, you know, fundings and deadlines and stuff like that. But my intervention here was to tell, okay, if we talk about diasporas, there is much more of this daily practical that people actually have in common. And in the end of the day, if you see all these examples, then it doesn't matter what a vase or a basket look like, but what matters is that it is a basket and that is used for a particular purpose. So I strongly would greet exhibitions that also show that there is nothing spectacular, there is nothing different, that there is, you know, so that people can recognize like common humanity in a very practical sense, which I think would be a great thing to do. And just to end here and to say that I have been involved recently in this project on how to make museums integration arenas for refugees, and we had several moments where we, with groups of people who came from Syria like 1 to 2 years ago, we went to a regional museum in Kristianstad, in a small town in southern Sweden. And one part of the, well, whatever you call it, exercise or experiment, I don't know, observational moment was to, and that was a part of these people's school Swedish exercises and so on, so they didn't, yeah, they did it as a part of school hours there. So one was that the curators of the museum was taking them to the exhibition of the regional culture and history in that museum. And the other was that we were with them in the depots, or whatever you call it in English, you know, in the depot, yeah. And as much as it was very difficult for them to, because of language and a myriad of other things, to actually relate to some things in this curated museum exhibition, we all had the most wonderful time in the depot because people could, they were free to pick whatever talks to them, because there is a difference in what Ghanaians or Croats or Dutch have to say about something, or how some objects, whatever it is talking to them, or how they, you know, why they see it, how they potentially feel attached to an object that they see in a depot, without it being its meanings being fixated or highlighted or whatever with them. So it was absolutely wonderful. I'm going to write about it, so I hope we stay in touch. Yeah.
No, but I'd like to close now because I think we could stop after the day. But it is not to suggest. Actually, I also found your presentation liberating because it offers us other possibilities for thinking about what these objects can do and how do they work in other circuits and other mediums. One of the things that I think is important for the work that we try to do here is that we also try to, within RCMC anyway, we also try to not see the museum as so much separate from the discussions that are happening in society, but rather as very integral to those discussions. And therefore, one of my colleagues has written about during a period in the Netherlands when they were teaching people language, how they need to learn Dutch by also learning their own culture. And they came to the Tropo Museum to look at objects that were important for them. And one guy who was, I think he was Moroccan, but he didn't want that. He wanted an object from Afghanistan. That was what was important for him. So, you know, so he was being forced into that, but he didn't want it. He wanted something else. So there are also all of these possibilities. And it is one, that's why I started out this morning by saying that we have the best job in the world, because we have 500,000 objects to try and think through exactly how do these things mediate these multiple possibilities in the present, without denying the fact that many of these possibilities are deeply embedded in the structures of inequality, of hierarchies, of whatever, that still animate the present, but that we can escape from those as well. So that is one of the possibilities, one of the exciting things. I want to close by suggesting that I want to close with Pim's closing presentation, primarily because I think that what that did was not only that it whet literally our appetites, but rather that it also gave us the possibility of thinking about how we ourselves are implicated in the object worlds, in these spaces of migration, of movement, that we ourselves are negotiating them not necessarily as distant, but actually as complexly entangled in the narratives that we try to curate. And that, I think, is a part of the practice that we hope to push forward as we try to articulate our collections with a broader thing. But for us, it is always deeply political as we try to think of how do we repair histories after particular histories, and how do we care not only for objects, but also for the people who are associated with them. Thank you all. But before you do that, I want to invite Laura. I want to thank Laura for conceptualizing and doing all of the work. And I invite her to just close off.
So thank you, Paul, for this final bit. It was really, really good.
I do look like him, but he's more handsome.
Oh, Wayne, sorry. I keep mixing up your names. Okay, so I would like to thank everyone that came and endured all of the day with us. Thank you for the Research Center of Material Culture for hosting this event and for wanting to actually do something with this idea. Thank you to all of the speakers. And I hope that everyone is able to take something with them that might be useful in the future. There will be a blog post, follow-up of the conversations we've had here in the museum website. So if you are interested, and I would be really grateful if you have any comments or just ideas of what could have worked a bit better. If you could send them to the RCMC website through the email or Facebook group, that would be really helpful, especially for me. So feedback is welcome. And so thank you everyone and have a good day.
Yes.
So Maya was noting that she's really tired and she would like to go back to the hotel and then meet us afterwards for the dinner.